All right, everybody, welcome to Personality Crisis. I don't even know which episode this is. I missed the last one because I planned poorly. But we're here. I'm John Cole. We're here today with Mark Jacob, esteemed journalist from Chicago who uh, has a long and storied history in journalism there. And he's going to talk with us today about, I think we decided we were going to talk about the history of the Times and then talk about some current stuff going on in the history of journalism in the last couple of years, how they've covered things, a number of things we brought up before we started taping here. If you're new to this, here is the premise of Personality Crisis. We have Doug J and Mr. Mix, who are two fellow bloggers and personalities we've known for a while. Uh, I serve as basically the man on the street. We looked at the three of us, and I was the one that was probably the one that was going to ask the dumbest, most normal questions. So what we try to do is try to get experts in here and ask them questions from a layman's perspective. The rules of the game are I am not allowed to do any research on Mark Jacob. Unfortunately, I already follow him on Blue Sky, so I know a little bit about him. Uh, and the idea is that with me going in with no idea who I'm talking to or what I'm talking about will better serve the rest of you idiots out there who also have no idea what you're doing or what you're talking about. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mark. Mark, do you want to do a little introduction of yourself? And you have a long storied background in Chicago.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been in daily newspapering for like 4 decades. Out of it now, I was mostly with the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times. My last job at the Trib was Metro editor, which was head of the biggest department and the biggest newsroom in the Midwest. Now I write the Stop the Press's newsletter. Comes out weekly. It's free. It deals with media and politics. And basically, my premise that the media is doing a pretty terrible job at covering the political crisis in this country.
Do you want to give everybody the URL or a way to get to
Well,
your?
the best thing to do is Google Mark Jacob, MarkJacob, no S, and then Stop the Presses, and it'll come right up.
Okay, excellent. And do not confuse him with the fashion designer Marc Jacobs with a C and an S on the end of Jacobs. Um, Earlier, we were talking about the New York Times and how they cover things. And you mentioned something I thought was pretty funny. You mentioned that you think they have what you call it as a department of euphemisms or a euphemisms department. And what I'd like you to do is, could you just do a little bit of background on the New York Times and how they've really always served kind of as a defender of whatever the status quo is for the elites. And
Well, yeah, I think that they just are seem to be really averse to being direct and saying what actually happened. So my theory is that they have a euphemism desk that they run all their stories through to come up with their, instead of calling someone a liar, for example, they'll say that they have a penchant for dispensing with the facts, stuff like that. And they may have, who knows, they may have laid off their euphemism desk and routed that all to their AI euphemism department. Who knows? But they're just not directly telling the American people facts that are obvious that a lot of people are not paying attention to. Frankly, they ought to be telling the American people right now that Trump is building a dictatorship, because that's exactly what's happening, and it's exactly what they were afraid to tell people about. But the problem, I think, at the New York Times is that and the publisher Sulzberger said this in a famous speech in London a year or two ago, that they don't really want to be on the right side of history. They don't want to worry about being on the right side of history. That their job is just to sort out the facts as they are right now, and they just can't worry about how they look decades from now. And I got to looking at the New York Times, and the reason I think they feel that way is because they've been on the wrong side of history so often in the past.
can you give some examples?
Well, I mean, more recent examples, they were totally wrong about the invasion of Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction. They bought right into that. But in ancient, his more ancient history, Their correspondent Walter Duranty was, in Stalin's pocket and totally denied the terror famine that he unleashed on Ukraine in the 1930s. So I mean, they just were wrong about it, and they got a Pulitzer Prize from it that they haven't given back yet, even though they kind of they admit that they did some wrong things. They wrote a story in the early 1900s about how manned controlled space, air flight, airplanes were, probably, could be a million years away developing that. They published that story 69 days before the Wright brothers' flight. So, I mean, they one of my favorites that the New York Times was wrong about, what happened fairly recently, in the last decade, where they did a review of a streaming series on Amazon called Goliath, and the critic argued that the start of the thing was that the time elements were all out of whack at the start of the streaming series. They later had to do a correction because the critic watched the first two episodes out of order. So so it's stuff like that. I mean, both big and little things. Now, but the thing about Hitler, and this is really instructive when you look at how poorly the New York Times has covered Trump and how much they've minimized the threat that he poses, because when they were covering Hitler, the first time they ever wrote about Hitler in 1922, they said that his anti-Semitism was not so genuine and violent as it sounded. They said that he was merely doing it to stir up the masses, and you really didn't need to worry about Hitler hating the Jews. That wouldn't come to much. And then obviously he tried the beer hall putsch. He tried a coup, got thrown in prison, got out of prison, and the New York Times reported that he had been tamed. That was a headline, that Hitler had been tamed. Well, we all saw what happened there. But even as Nazism really became entrenched in Germany, New York Times was still doing kind of interesting features on Trump and his hideaway in the mountains. I mean, they just whiffed on that one, and they're whiffing in the last decade. They've whiffed on Trump too. They just have not taken seriously his threat to our way of life.
All right. One of the things that bothers me and drives me insane about the New York Times is not only do they, the euphemisms and downplaying and minimizing and all that stuff, they seem absolutely allergic to making any connections whatsoever. Like they completely, yes, Project 2025 exists.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they're all at CPAC in Hungary for 10 years. Yes, they've elected a strongman to do all these things. Yes, he's doing the same things they're doing, that Viktor Orban did in Hungary to all the colleges and universities and everything else here. Yes, it's all there. Find me a story where they put all that together and make a connection. You won't. They'll be, oh, here's Project 2025, but it's probably not going to happen. It's just some cranks over here. Or, oh, yeah, they're going to CPAC in Hungary just for outreach or whatnot. And they never make any of the connections, and it drives me absolutely insane.
Well, this is the big kind of drum I've been pounding on, in the recent years, and it's not just the New York Times; it's a lot of mainstream media, it's all the TV networks, etc. But every story is a one-off. It's not like especially with Trump and his mentally deranged behavior. Him cheering about Bob Mueller's death and posting video of the Obamas as apes, and a video of him dropping excrement on protesters. I mean, there's every one of those stories, it tends to be just a one-off. They report it, it just throw it in the river, it rolls down the river, never to be seen again. Instead of doing when I was assigning stories at the Chicago Tribune, we would what I used to call hit the total button, which was get all these little things that happen, add them up all together, and write a big, what I'd also called an umbrella story that kind of gets at everything that's happening, all the data points you have, and what it means. And what it means is that Trump is mentally unfit to be in office. And It's obvious, but they won't write a headline saying it. They instead, instead it's every time they report that he did something completely crazy, like the most recent one where he's trying to exterminate an entire civilization of 93 million people. It's just they report that, but they won't go to the obvious total button, which says that the man is mentally deranged and a danger to all of us.
Yeah, I still don't think have they even used the word lie yet.
You know what, they didn't for a long time because they were they and the Washington Post was the same way. They said, you can't read his mind. It's not, maybe it's not an intentional lie. Maybe it's just what he thinks is true. But I think that's a BS, because if he says the same lie 3 dozen times and it's been fact checked every time, and he keeps on saying it, well, it's what in the news business for libel purposes we would call reckless disregard for the facts, and that's lying. I mean, he's lying, and always, and he doesn't care about about the truth, and the New York Times sometimes will call him out for lies, but mostly it's the most egregious ones. They were the big lie, the one about the 2020 election. They started calling a lie, but they still are very hesitant to use the word, and they won't call him a liar. I'm not sure they've ever called him a liar, which he's the most famous liar in American history. So, you seem like it'd be a smart thing to do to call him a liar.
If I ran the New York Times, I think in the top left corner of the front page, I would have a running tally of weeks since Donald Trump promised to release his health care plan, and it would be we'd be up to like what 7,000 weeks.
Right.
Weeks
Yeah.
since Donald Trump promised X, and go on and on, and they just don't address it. They don't address that. They'll say, "Oh, he said this today," and
Right.
then that's it, and you're
Right.
left.
Right. Well, and you know what? That's how he gets away with these lies. That's why these lies are effective. One of the things that almost gets almost no attention, but I keep on raising it, is that, in August 2016, he announced there was all these questions about Melania and how the heck she got to this country and, got permanent resident status and all that, and whether she was working illegally as a model in New York, that kind of stuff. And so Trump announces, he says, my wife will have a news conference sometime in the next 2 weeks to address all of your questions about this. That was the last we heard of it. So it's been a decade since then, and nothing. And you know what? He got away with it. It was a total, just flat out lie. We still don't have any explanation for her immigration history, which is very dodgy when you think about it. This Einstein, visa and stuff like that. But the news media just let it drop. It's just, again, it just rolled down the river, never to be seen again.
Just thinking about this, it makes me think the entire New York Times staff, or at least the people making the decisions, basically seem to function like Guy Pearce's character, Leonard Shelby in Memento. Every morning he wakes up and he's just a blank slate, doesn't know what happened yesterday, can't remember anything, and that's where we are. They also kind of function, I guess, now that I think about it, they kind of function like an AI search. You put it in there and they'll spit out blank facts,
Mm-hmm.
but not make any connection or
make a false connection.
frame of understanding or reference for the readers. And so,
yeah, the sad thing is that, I hate to bash the New York Times, because Lord knows we need, experienced journalists, doing hard work, and they have a lot of good reporters. I mostly blame the editors. Having been an editor almost my entire career, I blame the editors, because they are the ones that are not assigning the stories that they should assign. They're the ones that are. I feel like the New York Times is afraid of being a player in the drama. I think that they'd much rather be safely on the sidelines and just chronicling the destruction of this country by right-wing extremists. But they don't want to. They don't want to. I just feel like, I just wonder what they're going to think when they're like frog marched out of the newsroom at gunpoint. Because they're not doing anything to stop that from happening. They really are not. They're not. They're not, and they're not alone. I mean, think about what's happening in this country, and all the steps that the Trump regime has taken to take away our rights and to shoot people on the street. I mean, this is a very extreme fascist movement to destroy our democracy going on right now. It's the biggest story in the lifetimes of every person who's in the news business right now. It's the biggest story they could ever dream of is right in front of them, yet they don't want to cover it. Yet they don't want to cover it as a big story. They want to cover one little snippet of it.
I'm suppressing a primal scream. It's everything. Even with the current market behaving the way it is, they're in this bubble. Like I keep every day, I keep looking at the market. And I was like, how is this market reacting this way? I
Yeah,
don't understand. It's. Somebody said it's basically just a mood ring for rich dudes at this point. I can't think of any other way because how and what planet is all of this going on with the Strait of Hormuz closing down, Asia like a week away from running out of LNG, us
right,
running out of, I mean,
right, right. And all this
all,
encouragement. I mean, every bad actor on the planet has been encouraged to be a worse actor because of what Trump has done with this Iran stuff.
oh,
I
and
mean, you
just
think,
supply
well,
shortages alone are gonna, like,
I mean, think of what this means for whether China decides to attack Taiwan. I mean, you think that they think that they're going to, the U.S. has used up a bunch of its armaments. What are they? Are they really going to get in a fight with the Chinese? I think the Chinese are thinking about that right now. And yet this whole kind of it's not just an AI bubble. I think it's just this kind of bubble of unreality. And the real problem is they've been bailed out so many times when they do terrible things. The financial industry in this country, to where I think they feel like all the risk is upside. It's all that if they fail, they'll somehow be okay, but if they succeed, they'll just be rich and they can buy their third home in the Hamptons. And but it's not reality based. If you're paying any attention to what's actually going on right now, we're in a tremendous crisis, the worst crisis in this country since the Civil War. I mean, really, it is. I mean, just look at it by any measure, and what's happening is just terrible. And
well, and
yet,
we're about to. Not only is all that going on, the clamping down of rights and the lawlessness, but we're also heading into a 70s oil shock, and at the same time are close to, very close, I think, to mass unemployment of white collar individuals that are going to make the lost steel jobs and lost coal jobs look like nothing. And if we get to self-driving trucks, we're at Armageddon, because I mean we've seen how what 150,000, 200,000 lost steel worker jobs and coal mining jobs basically has shaped politics for the last 40 years in the Rust Belt and where I'm from in Chicago and everything like that. Well, we're about to hit layoffs that are going to make that look like nothing if you start going after self-driving trucks, if you start talking about AI replacing all of the lower entry level managers and things of that nature. And on top of everything else, I mean, we are in a very perilous situation right now, and it doesn't feel like anybody's being honest about it.
right, right. And well, I think part of the reason for that is that you have this, and the statistics bear this out. You have this great division between rich and poor in this country that's getting even to be bigger, to where the rich people feel like they're making tons of money and they're going to keep on making tons of money. And they don't really care that much if the poor people get screwed. And that's who you're talking about, the truck drivers and people like that who people are working blue collar jobs and white collar jobs, but not like, big, high paid ones. And I just feel like they're setting up a situation where the extremely wealthy in this country are going to be cushioning themselves from any of the impact of the horrible disaster that they themselves are building. And that if there's not a democracy, if they can steal the democracy to where people don't have a chance to throw them the hell out of office, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to them if three-quarters of the American public thinks they're terrible, if that three-quarters of the American public has no political power. And so I feel like they're almost in a race to steal our democracy before they collapse the entire economy, the economy that you and me and most normal people live in. I mean, I just feel like we're almost running out of chances. I think that this year is going to tell it. Either we're gonna have midterm elections, the Republicans are going to lose miserably, or the Republicans are going to try to steal the elections, or cancel the elections, or do something. I mean, that those are all real possibilities. I mean, you look at what's happening when you have the President of the United States threatening to destroy an entire civilization, an ancient civilization of many, many, many millions of people, and you just wonder what is he capable of, and what is he not capable of. And I really don't see anything he's not capable of. He tried to overthrow the government back in on January 6th. I mean, that's what that was about. And they got away with it. They didn't succeed, but they didn't get punished for it, and here they are back at it. So I think that this is what really the to me is the great tragedy of the New York Times and other big media, is that they're not doing their most basic duty of journalism, which is to warn people of threats to their safety and well-being. They're not doing that. They are trying to amuse them with crossword puzzles and recipes, but they're not saying, "Holy shit, we're in terrible trouble. You got to act." They're not saying that, and in fact, they're trying to discourage people from thinking that by pretending that this is all normal. And so it's a giant journalism failure when journalism has been set up as it's been cited in the Constitution as an important part of democracy, yet it's one of the parts of democracy that is failing.
Do you, I mean, as a historian of this stuff, do you see the New York Times getting progressively worse with
No,
this?
actually, I see them getting slightly better in the last little bit. I mean, they've been pretty good on the war. In fact, most mainstream media have been pretty good on the war, and that's I think because partly because the Trump people didn't even try to sell it. You look back. I was on the foreign desk at the Chicago Tribune back during the Iraq War, and we watched as W tried to sell that war. He and Cheney tried to sell that war for months, and they got a vote in Congress too. Just that didn't, so I think that because of that, and because it's, I mean, just because the Trump people have really not done their work to try to sell the American people on this. I feel like the mainstream news media have been surprisingly good in covering how terrible this war has gone. Now that you're still getting constant lies, every day by the Trump people. That Iran bombed its own girls' school. Yeah, right. Stuff like that. I mean, you're getting these outrageous lies and this bizarre religious extremism, like God wants us to blow up Iran, that kind of stuff. Um, but I don't think the newspapers are and the news organizations, the big ones. I don't think they're underplaying that too much. I think, I mean, in some cases they are, but mostly they've done a better job on that than they did on what I would call the rise of fascism over the last decade, and the complete fraud. Trump defrauding the electorate with lies and I mean just greed. Lies like they're eating the dogs and cats in Ohio. That kind of stuff. I mean that. I mean there are so many things, John, where there are so many things where just in isolation, they're disqualifying for a president of the United States or somebody who's running for president of the United States. They're making fun of the disabled, the calling McCain, saying he wasn't a hero. That kind. I mean, there's so many disqualifying acts, and yet it seems like I feel like the New York Times and other media just kind of wrote about it for a day or two, shrugged their shoulders, and moved on.
Yeah, I, it just all feels crazy in the Trump era because, like, there are people like me who remember Jeff Girth, you know, going after Whitewater, and what remember Wenho Lee, the Chinese scientists and all that. That was all Jeff Girth in the New York Times. But if they had 1/10 of the tenacity that they had for Whitewater,
Mm-hmm.
that they have for anything, literally anything Trump has done, and this is not a defense of the Clintons, uh,
Right.
you, but like, I mean, my God, just the emails.
Right.
I mean, we
Right.
that was an entire campaign story for a year, a year
But
long smear campaign on top of a 35-year attack campaign against Hillary Clinton that the New York Times did a full court press on. And my God, they're doing Pete Hegseth and these guys are doing worse things on the daily.
on the daily. Well, the funny thing was that, not funny, haha, but funny was that the Trump people, as soon as they got into office, back in 2017, they did all the bad stuff with their emails that they had that Hillary had been accused of. Even worse. Because they didn't even have security clearances or anything. I feel like that whole thing with
You could
Hillary and the
almost,
emails.
you could
Hmm?
almost read you could almost read Kash Patel, the FBI director's personal emails in real time, thanks to Iran. I mean,
Right. Well, right, think also. By the way, think about that whole Signalgate thing with Hegseth and Waltz, inviting a reporter in and talking about an upcoming military operation. In what other era would that have been tolerated? Nobody got fired over that. Nobody. But and that's the guy Hegseth, the guy who's like talking about how God's wreaking his vengeance on Iran right now. So there's no accountability. I feel like that the Hillary emails thing, though, was the New York Times wanting to do this kind of even-handed posturing because the New York Times, I think, is deathly afraid of being accused of being a liberal newspaper, so it obviously does the opposite. And it doesn't want to be a player in events, although it wants to be extremely financially successful and important, but it doesn't want it is afraid of looking like it's taking sides. Therefore, when Trump did horrendous things, grab him by the pussy, that kind of stuff, when that the New York Times initial thought was, well, we got to find out stuff that Hillary did that's as bad. Well, obviously, Hillary didn't do his stuff that was as bad. She may have done bad stuff, but not that bad. And so they had to equate the two in order for themselves to look even-handed and balanced. And the real problem here with the New York Times, in my opinion, is that they're thinking first and foremost about the New York Times, not about the country. When I often accuse people like Mitch McConnell of party over country, and the New York Times is guilty of paper over country, in my opinion.
we were going to have a second part to this, but once again, we have gone over our time limit. That's because I don't know how to shut up. Um, would you be interested in coming back for another session? Because I'd like to talk to you more about some of the stuff we were going to.
Well, I'd be happy to. Yeah, anytime.